Hello again. Um, this was the second half of my presentation on factory and farm. In the last segment, I talked about industrialization in the North primarily. Today, then, I want to talk about the agrarian South. The southern United States, of course, remained more agricultural than the North. But it was nonetheless also felt the impact of industrialization. As I mentioned in the previous section, the pilot sector for the British Industrial Revolution was cotton. And you can't grow cotton in England, but you can grow it in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. So the cotton, the flax that was being woven and spun in New England came often from the American South, which meant that it came off of the backs of African American slaves. The economy of the South was embedded in chattel slavery. The term chattel slavery is or was the practice of owning human beings as a type of property in order to profit from their labor. Of course, slavery, it was not new when it came to America in the 1600s. You can look in the Old Testament that talks about, needing to free your slaves every 7 years. Look at the history of Rome, history of Africa itself. I mean, all through most human history, slavery has been with us. But the difference, the significance of what the American experience of slavery is about is that issue of skin color. Chattel slavery in the United States was based on skin color, which was seen as the indicator of one's race. The term race, of course, is loaded, and it was used sometimes in the 19th century as a synonym for nationality. But here, of course, it refers to the color of one's skin, which in turn then was assumed to signal a number of other characteristics and qualities of the person. One of the key ways in which American slavery was perpetuated was that laws were passed in the colonial era and continued into the United States Constitution era, that the status of the child, was the child a slave or not, depended on what was his or her mother. And so the status of the child was determined by the status of his or her mother. This, of course, worked greatly to the advantage of white men who raped and sexually abused enslaved women. Even if the master was the father of the child, if the child was African American, it could not, by definition, be legitimate, because, of course, it was the status of the mother. So if the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. Children, of course, born, of mixed race to African American mothers could not then claim any inheritance from their fathers. It also meant that white women could pretend not to know about the sexual abuse that their male relatives engaged in and their husbands' abuse of enslaved women. One thing to keep in mind about American slavery is that it varied across the South. It was not the same everywhere. The plantation photograph that I had before, this is sometimes what we think of as the standard, model that, you know, you had the big mansion where the white people lived with their African-American servants, i.e. slaves, and they, you know, farmed a huge plantation, you know, for cotton, you know, or things like that. But it varied from state to state and region to region, in part due to whatever crops were being raised and the size of households and farms, and this sort of thing. The plantation type slavery with the huge tracts of land and gangs of slave labor were concentrated in the Mississippi River Valley, especially in Mississippi and Louisiana, and expanding across central part of Alabama and also the eastern part of South Carolina, and also parts of Texas. And these were places where masters had, you know, 15 to 20 slaves on an estate. In other areas like Missouri, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, slaveholders had fewer slaves, often maybe 2 or 3. And you could see ads even in things like the Liberty Tribune, although this is an ad from a South Carolinian newspaper, where this man is hiring out 15 or 12 or 15 likely Negroes. He's not selling them, but he's essentially selling their labor, you know, that they will go and labor for whoever hires them, but the pay that is made for their effort goes to the master. I also need to acknowledge that slavery, especially in what we call the Deep South, the Cotton South, you know, Alabama, Mississippi, that area, was possible because of the removal of Native Americans. This is a map that represents some of the tribes and, you know, their removal. This was most prominently happening in the 1830s and 40s, particularly under the leadership of Andrew Jackson. The most famous and iconic image of this removal is the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears in 1838, when thousands of Cherokee were forced to walk from, you know, the Appalachians there to Kansas or Oklahoma. So the Creeks and the Chickasaws, Cherokees, Seminoles were all shoved out, and then white people, you know, could snap up the land. This is a map from 1860 that shows you the differentiation in terms of the concentration of where enslaved people were to be found. So that the darker the squares, or the darker the county, the more slaves were there. And you can see then, you know, here's the Mississippi River, and all along here it's pretty dark. Over here on the coast of South Carolina and going into Georgia, across central Alabama, and into parts of Texas. Notice up here in Missouri, you know, it's a lot lighter, but still this is a slave state. And I think the data was taken from the census of 1860. It's interesting, notice that the map says it was sold for the benefit of sick and wounded soldiers of the US Army. All right. So who do we find in Southern society? Because the South's economy was based in agriculture and in the profits of slave labor, living and working conditions for working people, slave or free, were rather different than what we find in the North. First of all, family life. unlike in the industrial, cities where work and home were now two different places, on a plantation, they stay the same place. So work and home are, you work in home, you work at home, and home is where you work. People lived and, played and worked in the same place. The defense of women was seen as a crucial value and a very important one for Southern men in particular. If one dared insult a respectable Southern woman, her husband or her father or her brothers were expected to, leap to her defense and defend her honor, the family honor, up to and including shooting people. The use of duels as a way to defend one's honor was still very prevalent in the South as compared to the North. So I probably should have swapped the third line there about the honor of women was paramount with the question about motherhood. Because you remember we talked about the cult of true womanhood and the domestic sphere where the highest thing that a woman could be was a mother. We don't see the same adoration or kind of sanctification of mothers in the South. For one thing, infants, especially for wealthy women, were raised by Black nurses, starting from when they were infants and needed to be breastfed. And as they grew older, the children were continually, seen to by children. And so that because wealthy white women turned the care of their infants and children over to servants, to slaves, your authors of your textbook say, quote, maternity was neither revered nor sentimentalized, unquote. A third thing, and this is, I guess, why I have that one, is the purity of white women. White women who presided over plantations were expected to be sexually pure, selfless, and pious. I mean, it's not unlike the cult of the true womanhood. But Southern women were compared to Black enslaved women, not to white men. It became more and more common up to the Civil War for commentators to argue that the core of Southern society was not slavery, but the preservation of the purity and beauty and sexual innocence of white women. A Southern writer named Thomas Dew offered this statement, quote, "We behold the marked efficiency of slavery on the conditions of woman. We find her at once elevated, clothed with all her charms, mingling with and directing the society to which she belongs, no longer the slave, but the equal and idol of man." So that women are, held as to be the epitome of Southern culture. Also, key or one of the distinguishing characteristics of wealthy lifestyle was leisure. Work was for slaves. And so unlike the industrious housewives of New England or Pennsylvania, Southern wealthy women did the social rounds. They paid calls on their neighbors, or they went to church. They went to parties. They gave parties. So that, and the most people with the most leisure were unmarried young women, because they would have had no household responsibilities. Their mother would have supervised the house servants. A wealthy young Southern lady didn't even have to dress or bathe herself because she had slaves to do that for her. Slaves were there at her beck and call. But So here we have the kind of quintessential image that we have of a Southern lady. You notice she's richly dressed and has interesting jewelry on, and is clearly not expected to do anything useful in that outfit. And this was a painting from 1850. Nice slide here. Oops. The problem was that slavery only worked because of violence. Slavery is rooted in violence and the threat of violence. If a true, lady or woman was expected to be nurturing and caring for all, including the poor and the needy, then Southern women in the middle and upper classes had a problem. Married women especially were expected to, supervise the work of slaves within the household. And oversee the cooks, the maids, the butlers, the inside servants. And the mistress of the plantation was also expected to have a caring eye for the whole of the slave force, including the field slaves. But managing enslaved people is eventually going to come down to violence. And what this drawing illustrates is that the violence of slavery was not just inflicted by men. A supposedly delicate and fragile woman could be sometimes found beating a maid who had broken a vase or ripped a dress. They also could be found asking their husbands to have a house servant whipped. Angelina Grimke, who will become a very famous abolitionist and women's rights advocate, called the women who were willing to beat their servants female tyrants. So violence goes along with family life, motherhood, purity, and leisure as characteristics of Southern society. It is also, the last one is, I guess I didn't do a slide on this one. Actually, well-to-do Southern women were even more limited in their options for what they could do in life than women of the North and Middle states. There was virtually no way in the Southern economy that a single woman could make a living, except maybe perhaps, at least not as a middle or upper class woman. Maybe you could be a companion to another upper class woman. But being an old maid meant then that you were dependent on the charity of your relatives. You had to hope that your brothers or your sisters would take you in, even if you had to be an unpaid drudge. Your educational opportunities as a woman were also more limited. Men, of course, could go to university. Jefferson had founded the University of Virginia. I'm not sure when the other Southern universities came along. But the education of women was much less intellectually rigorous, and was emphasized the accomplishments of a young lady, right? She was supposed to learn how to play a little music, do a little drawing and art, learn how to do needlework, and the kinds of things to occupy your time since you had leisure. The South did not generate the same kinds of reform and service-oriented organizations that we saw in the North, like the church mission societies or the charities that worked, to supply the poor, or of course, there's no way we're going to see abolitionists. So the constraints on upper class women are pretty profound. The Grimke sisters, for example, didn't find a way to break free of the constraints of this life, even though they came from a wealthy family, until they moved to Pennsylvania. Of course, the wealthy were a small cadre of people. We do have something of a middle class, a bit smaller than what you'd find in the North, what the British might have called the middling sorts. They tended to be more urban, or at least in towns, and included educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, ministers, bankers, men with, who were esteemed in the community, but who were no way as wealthy as the landowners that they worked for. So when we think about poorer white families, most of them did not own slaves. 75% of Southern families had no slaves. These families worked at smaller farms in the tougher areas like Appalachia, raising their own food, perhaps raising enough to take some to market or to turn into hooch. They also would find employment as overseers. They might learn a trade like blacksmithing, or although slaves were more likely to learn that, but I don't know, bookmaking, or, I'm just trying to think what would be silversmiths, or they could be shopkeepers. As free white men, they usually had the vote, and their political support of pro-slavery politicians and the men above them socially helped to shore up the legal system that kept slavery in place. These white men also shared to an extent in the masculine culture of with their well-to-do betters, a culture that involved mostly drinking and politics, and of course making sure that both women and blacks stayed in their places. This is, I think, an interesting painting of what are called the title, obviously you can see for yourselves, North Carolina Emigrants, Poor White Folks. So these are people who are moving from one part of North Carolina into the mountains. And notice, they've just got the one poor broken down horse. They have 3 kids there, including the baby in arms, and it looks like maybe they have 1 cow, and they're stopping off to water their animals and perhaps get a drink of water for themselves. They might have homesteaded or bought a small farm. There was obviously then a great gap, a pretty big gap between plantation mistresses and farm wives. There were very few points of contact over the course of a regular day. I mean, what reason would a poor white woman have to go to the big house or the plantation? And so that, unlike the men who could share that culture of drinking and gambling and politics, Southern women tended to stay in their own social circles and not mix. Farm wives, of course, worked very long and hard to support their families, or help support their families. And they are, living at a level more like we might have found in colonial New England. They are still spinning and weaving at home and sewing their own clothes, long after it became the norm for Northern women to buy their clothes on ready-made, or at least to buy fabric that was machine-made. They tended livestock and grew vegetable gardens and ate most of what they could raise, and did not sell much in the markets. Attending church was about the only time that a Southern farm wife left her hearth and interacted with other members of the community. This is one reason why revivals were so popular not only across upstate New York, but across the South. They were something different than the usual Sunday service. They might, have a meeting every day for the week that the preacher was there. And they provided a great deal of social opportunities, for having a potluck supper, or a sewing bee, or these kinds of things, as well as spiritual opportunities to get back in touch with God. So we have, essentially, and then, 3 ranks of white people. All right. What about slaves? The slave trade, the movement of people from Africa to the United States and to be sold, ended in 1807. This was a provision of the Constitution that required the slave trade to end. But as you well know, it is not the end of slavery. What it did mean, though, is that the perpetuation of chattel slavery in the South required enslaved women to bear children, who, of course, the children would be slaves in their turn. So, African Americans did many kinds of work. House slaves performed the work of domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, childcare, laundry, waiting on individuals in the white family. But both men and women in the African American slave ranks worked in the fields. The Black women weren't considered too delicate to work in this hard agricultural work, picking cotton, planting, hoeing, harvesting, and of course, all for the market and for the profit of their master. Enslaved women, like white women, were also expected to care for their families and the wider community. This could mean sometimes, for example, that older slave women who were looking after infants would bring the babies to the field so the mother could breastfeed her infant and not have to, and the master didn't have to do without her work for that day. Caring for the sick, acting as midwives, both for their own people and for white people, fell to slave women. The great fear, of course, for African American mothers was that their children would be sold, or that they would be, sent away or somehow other separated. If any of you have read Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, or seen the movie that Oprah Winfrey had made of it, it's based on the true story of a slave mother named Margaret Garner, who escaped from Kentucky and made it to Ohio. But this is in the era of the Fugitive Slave Act, and so the slave catchers were after her. And when they found her, she she murdered her own daughter. She slit the girl's throat rather than see her returned to Kentucky into a life of slavery. There was actually a debate about what would happen to her in the aftermath of this, because of course, the slave catchers and her master are saying she needs to be taken back to Kentucky. But the prosecutor, see, I'm trying to think, the way that it was phrased was that, her attorneys argued that she couldn't be taken back to Kentucky because she had to stand trial in Ohio for the murder of her daughter. However, she was returned to Kentucky. She was sold into the Deep South and died, 2 years after this took place. So slave women as mothers are valued. Oops. There is evidence that slaveholders encouraged or even forced African American couples to bear children, or they raped and sexually assaulted African American women themselves, and if they became impregnated, of course, the child then was a slave. There are advertisements that refer to women as good breeders who commanded higher prices in the market than did other kinds of women. So there are some evidence for the idea that slaves were bred in order to have more slaves. African Americans, though, found ways to endure. They tapped into their own traditions of music and religious faith, extended family, and even food. And of course, such consolations were needed. It was a brutal life and often a brutal death.